Imagine being told that you are in the one place on Earth you cannot escape from. Not because there are too many guards, not because the walls are too high, but because the Germans themselves have decided it. They have looked at the map, they have read the files on every man inside, and they have made a conclusion. If you have already escaped somewhere else, if you have already proven that you are the kind of man who will never stop trying, then you go to Colditz. Because Colditz is where escapes come to die. That is what the Germans believed, and for most of the war, they were right. Colditz Castle sat on a ridge in Saxony, in the heart of Germany. It was not a flat prison compound where a man could dig and run. It was a medieval stone fortress built on a cliff, with walls 5 feet thick, guards walking every hour, searchlights sweeping the courtyard at night, and a drop of 60 meters on one side straight down to the river Mulde below. The Germans staffed it with 1 guard for every prisoner, a ratio no other camp in Germany could match. They called it Sonderlager, special camp, the place for the difficult ones. The men inside were not ordinary prisoners. They were officers, British, French, Polish, Dutch, who had already escaped from other camps and been caught. Men who had crawled through tunnels, worn disguises, forged identity papers, and still ended up back in German hands. They were sent to Colditz because the Germans believed that if you put all the troublemakers in one place, you could watch all of them at once. What the Germans did not count on was what happens when you put the most creative, most determined, most stubborn men in the world all in the same building and give them nothing to do but think. Inside Colditz, there was a rhythm to captivity. Roll call twice a day, meals at fixed hours, long stretches of silence between. Some men read, some men exercised, some men learned languages, and some men, the ones who could not stop, sat and stared at walls and thought about the one question that every prisoner in every camp throughout the war thought about every single day. How do I get out? It is 1944. The war in Europe is entering its final chapter, though nobody inside Colditz knows yet how close the end is. Allied bombers cross German skies almost every night now. On some evenings, the men inside the castle can hear the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire. They can see the searchlights cutting through the darkness beyond the ridge, and they know, all of them know, that somewhere out there the Allies are advancing. The question is not whether Germany will fall. The question is whether they will still be alive when it does. Because by 1944, the rules of the game had changed. In March of that year, 76 men broke out of Stalag Luft 3, the mass escape that the world would later call the Great Escape. It was the most ambitious prison break of the entire war, and when Hitler heard about it, he made a decision that shocked even some of his own generals. He ordered that 50 of the recaptured men be shot, not imprisoned, not punished, executed, in the woods, with no trial, no warning, just a pistol and an order. 50 men. 50 men who had done nothing more than try to go home. After that, the Allied High Command sent a quiet message through the Red Cross to every POW camp in Germany. Stop escaping. The risk is too high. The price is too steep. Wait for liberation. Inside Colditz, that message landed hard. Some men accepted it. Some men argued about it. But there was one man, a British Army officer named Tony Rolt, who could not stop thinking. Not about digging, not about tunnels or disguises or forged papers. He was thinking about something else entirely, something no one had ever tried in a POW camp before. He was looking at the roof. Tony Rolt was not a pilot. He was a racing driver, the kind of man who understood mechanics, speed, and the relationship between a machine and the forces working against it. He had been at Colditz for months, and like every prisoner, he had memorized the layout of the castle from the inside out. He knew which windows were watched and which were not. He knew which corridors were patrolled and which were left to silence. And one day, while standing in the upper part of the castle near the chapel, he looked up and noticed something the Germans had apparently never thought about. The roofline of the chapel was completely hidden from the guards' positions below. He stood there and thought about that for a long moment. Then he looked out at the ridge. The drop on the other side was 60 meters, nearly 200 feet, straight down to the river Mulde. And beyond the river, on the far side, was open countryside. No guards, no searchlights, just fields and roads, and eventually, freedom. Tony Rolt was not a pilot, but he understood physics, and he thought, what if a man didn't need to climb down? What if a man could fly across? He brought the idea to two men, Bill Goldfinch and Jack Best, both Royal Air Force officers, both engineers, both the kind of men who, when presented with what should have been an impossible problem, sat down quietly and started doing math. Goldfinch and Best went to the prison library. It was not much of a library. A few donated volumes, some novels, some textbooks. But somewhere on one of those shelves, they found a 2-volume work titled Aircraft Design by C.H. Latimer Needham. It was a technical manual, the kind of book you would find in an engineering school, not a prison camp. It contained the physics of flight, the mathematics of wing design, and detailed diagrams of how an aircraft structure was meant to hold itself together under pressure. Goldfinch read it carefully. Then he started drawing plans. What they needed was a glider. Not a full aircraft. There was no engine, no fuel, and nowhere near enough space to build one. A glider. A simple, lightweight, unpowered aircraft that could be launched from the chapel roof, catch the air, and glide across the river before anyone on the ground had time to react. 2 men could ride it. The plan was to use an air raid blackout as cover. When the searchlights went dark and the guards' attention turned to the sky, to cut a hole in the chapel roof, roll the glider out, and launch it into the night. The math worked out. Barely, but it worked. Now came the hard part. There was no wood to spare inside Colditz. Every scrap of material was accounted for. But there were beds. Long wooden bed slats that the men slept on every night. And there were floors, old floorboards that had been in the castle for decades. And there were walls, with electrical wiring running through unused portions of the building. There were German ration bags of millet, which could be boiled into a thick paste. And there were sleeping bags, blue and white checked cotton, that, stretched over a frame and painted with boiled millet, could be made tight enough to seal the surface of a wing. One by one, bed slats began to disappear. Quietly. 1 slat per man per night, so that the change was too slow to notice. Floorboards came up in sections in out-of-the-way corners. Electrical wiring was stripped from walls in parts of the castle the guards rarely visited. Every piece was carried in small amounts through passages and up staircases to a single location, the lower attic above the chapel. Goldfinch and Best gathered 12 helpers. The men called them the Apostles. Each one had a specific job. Each one knew exactly what he was building and exactly what the stakes were. They built a false wall across one end of the attic. a partition that looked, to anyone glancing in, like a structural element of the building. Behind it, in a space that no guard had reason to enter, they began to construct an aircraft. Over 30 wing ribs, each one cut by hand from bed slats, using tools made from gramophone springs and iron window bars. Wing spars fashioned from floorboards, shaped and sanded until they had the correct cross-section. Control cables woven from electrical wire. A rudder built in the style of a civilian design called the Luton Major. Every measurement taken from the book. Every cut made by hand, in silence, behind a false wall, in a prison that had been declared impossible to escape from. They set up electric alarms, wired to a buzzer inside the hidden workshop, so that if a guard approached the attic entrance, the men could stop, cover their work, and wait in silence until the footsteps passed. They placed lookouts at every approach corridor. The Germans, trained to watch for tunnels going down, had never thought to search for workshops going up. The construction took months. The German garrison never found it. While Goldfinch and Best built the glider, they had to solve one more problem: how to get it off the ground. A glider needs speed to fly, and the roof of a castle is not a runway. They had no engines. They had no long, flat surface to roll down. What they had was gravity. The plan was this: a 20-meter runway, assembled from tables laid end to end along the chapel roof, concealed below the roofline and invisible from the ground, would be the launch path. At one end of the runway, a pulley system. At the other end, a rope connected to a bathtub. The bathtub would be filled with concrete and dropped off the edge of the roof. The falling weight would yank the glider forward through the pulley, accelerating it down the runway to approximately 50 kilometers per hour, just enough to achieve lift. Then the glider would clear the roofline, catch the air over the ridge, and begin its descent toward the river. If everything worked, 2 men would be across the wire, across the river, and into the countryside before the Germans even understood what had just happened. If anything went wrong, if the glider stalled, if the runway tables shifted, if the millet paste fabric tore in the night air, if the wind was wrong, or the angle was wrong, or the concrete was too light to generate enough speed, then 2 men would go off the edge of a castle at 60 meters above the river and fall. They knew that. They built it anyway. By the spring of 1945, the Colditz Cock, that was what they had named it, was nearly finished. It had a wingspan of 32 feet, tip to tip. It was just under 20 feet from nose to tail. It weighed 240 pounds. It was built from stolen beds and stripped floors, and boiled porridge and sleeping bags, by men working in a hidden room with tools made from gramophone parts, guided by a library book and a hand-drawn plan. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary objects ever made by human beings under pressure. And then the guns got louder. By April 1945, the sound of American artillery was no longer a distant rumble. It was close. Some nights, the men could hear individual explosions. They could feel, without being told, that the Americans were coming. The question now was not whether the glider would work. The question was whether they would need it at all. The British escape officer made a decision. The glider would be held in reserve, not for escape now, but for a different purpose. If the SS gave the order to execute the prisoners before the Americans arrived, and by 1945, that was not a paranoid fear. There were documented SS orders to eliminate certain POW populations rather than let them be liberated. Then the glider would be the emergency option. 2 men in the air, across the river, reaching the American lines, carrying the message: "We are alive. Do not stop. Come now." It was a different kind of mission, but it was still a mission. On the morning of April 15, 1945, a small American task force reached the outskirts of Colditz. With them was a war correspondent named Lee Carson, one of only 2 American journalists assigned to the unit. When Carson entered the castle, she was looking for the story. What she found, when someone led her up to the chapel attic, was not something she had been prepared for. There, behind a false wall, in the dust and silence of a room that the guards had never once searched, was a full-sized aircraft. Made from beds, covered in sleeping bags, suspended in the dark like something from a dream. She took one photograph. It is the only photograph that exists of the original Colditz Cock. The Germans surrendered the castle the following day, April 16, 1945. The prisoners walked out through the front gate. For some of them, it was the first time they had left those walls in years. The glider remained in the attic. The castle fell within the Soviet occupation zone, and when the war ended and the borders were drawn, the British could not go back for it. What happened to the Colditz Cock after that, whether it was destroyed, dismantled, or simply left to rot in that attic, nobody knows. It vanished. The only evidence that it ever existed was a single photograph and a set of hand-drawn plans that Bill Goldfinch had quietly kept hidden in his belongings. Goldfinch survived the war. So did Best. So did Tony Rolt. Rolt went back to racing cars after the war. In 1953, he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans, one of the most famous motor races in the world. He crossed that finish line, having crossed so many others before it. Best became a schoolteacher. Goldfinch kept his drawings. 55 years after the end of the war, a British television company commissioned a full-scale replica of the Colditz Cock using Goldfinch's original plans. They built it at an airfield in southern England. And in the year 2000, with Goldfinch and Best and several of the original apostles standing on the grass watching, a pilot named John Lee climbed in, accelerated down the runway, and flew. On the first attempt. The glider flew perfectly, just as Goldfinch had calculated in a hidden attic in occupied Germany with a library book and a pencil and the quiet, stubborn conviction that it could be done. In 2012, an unmanned radio-controlled replica was launched from the actual chapel roof at Colditz Castle, the exact same launch point the prisoners had planned. And it flew across the river Mulda and landed safely in the meadow on the far side, 180 meters below, exactly where they said it would. Think about what that means. A group of men with no tools, no equipment, no factory, no computers, only stolen wood and wire and a prison library, designed and built an aircraft that, more than half a century later, proved to work exactly as designed. Not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. Nobody ordered them to build it. Nobody paid them. Nobody could promise them it would save their lives. They were cold and hungry and surrounded by guards and living under the shadow of what had happened to 50 men at Stalag Luft 3. They had been told to wait. They had been told to stop. And they looked at the chapel roofline and they looked at the river 60 meters below and they thought, no, not yet. Not while there is still something we can do. The Colditz Cock never flew in the war, but the fact that it exists, the fact that those men built it, says something that no weapon and no military order can say as clearly. That there is a version of courage that does not need a battlefield, that does not carry a gun, that does not make a sound. It just builds, quietly, behind a false wall, in the dark, and waits for the wind. If this story stayed with you, if you felt what those men felt in that attic, then you are the exact kind of person this channel is for. Hit subscribe, because the next escape file is already waiting. And I promise you, it is just as extraordinary as this one.